Dahil sa ikaw at ako,
natuto sa prinsipyong
yung at serbisyong totoo.
kahalintulad ni Kristo,
Isang puwarang Katoliko. Pagkakaisa
sa tulong at gawa,
masasalamat
sa lahat ng alaala,
pagbabago.
ang misyon sa mundo,
Magagawa sa biyaya ni Kristo.
ang kabataan
May hamon at alay,
sa ating bayan,
maging lingkod at tulad
ng pagbabago.
sa misyon sa mundo. Birhen Maria ang gabay at ang modelo. Mundong may bagong anyo, isang bansang may bagong sigla. Dahil sa ikaw at ako, natuto sa prinsipyong komunyo at serbisyong totoo. Kahalintulad ni Kristo, isang puwarang Katoliko. Bago, may bagong anyo.
Bago,
May bagong sigla. Komunyo, serbisyong totoo. Maging isang puwarang Katoliko. Dahil sa ikaw at ako,
natuto sa prinsipyong
iyo at serbisyong totoo.
kahalintulad ni Kristo,
Isang puwarang Katoliko. Pagkakaisa
sa tulong at gawa,
masasalamat
sa lahat ng alaala,
pagbabago.
ang misyon sa mundo,
Magagawa sa biyaya ni Kristo.
ang kabataan
May hamon at alay,
sa ating bayan,
maging lingkod at tulad.
ng pagbabago,
Sa misyon sa mundo, Birhen Maria ang gabay at ang modelo. Sa mundong may bagong anyo, isang bansang may bagong sigla. Dahil sa ikaw at ako, natuto sa prinsipyong komunyo at serbisyong totoo. Kahalintulad ni Kristo, isang puwarang Katoliko. May bagong anyo.
bago,
May bagong sigla. Komunyo, serbisyo, totoo.
afternoon, everyone. I am Carlo Abadines, the Advocacy Officer of the Catholic Educational Association of the Philippines, and I will be your moderator for today. Before we officially start the program, may I invite everyone to spend a moment of silence as we pray and ask God for His guidance and protection in these trying times. In the name of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit. Amen. We take a moment of silence as we remember our brothers and sisters who are growing hungry and are continuing to struggle to make ends meet in these difficult times. We also remember our frontliners, especially those in areas where the COVID pandemic is beginning to spread. Let us remember them who continue to work hard to ensure that we are safe and are able to go about our activities. Lord, we also want to thank you for gathering each one of us here today to spend time learning together as one faithful community. Be with us here today as we learn more about the sensitivities behind module making. Guide our speaker and bless her with the wisdom of the Holy Spirit. May your words of consolation, hope, and encouragement be shared through the speaker and inspire us to courageously move forward through this pandemic. Help us discern our steps forward. Help us learn as we continue the mission and vocation of education that you have called us into. Lord, as we continue to adapt and move forward through this pandemic, we beg for your grace that you send forth your Holy Spirit to grant us the courage, the hope, and the energy to continue pushing through. Lead us towards the path you wish for us to take, a path of love, a path of hope, and a path of courage. In Jesus' name we pray. Amen. In the name of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit. Amen. And so we are back again for another series of CEAP webinars covering a range of topics from module making to teaching strategies in the new normal. This is the very first of our series, and this will be further introduced by our Executive Director later on. But before we proceed, let me give a few reminders. First, all videos of the webinar sessions will be saved in the video section of our official Facebook page and in our YouTube CEAP channel. If you miss out a session, you can just go back to these sites to view them again. Second, as the talk is ongoing, you may post your questions in the comment section of this Facebook page or in the YouTube Live. So we will be asking these questions during the question and answer portion. Third, please be informed that you will receive the certificate of attendance only upon completion of the evaluation form. The link will be posted in the comment section later and will be available online until 7 p.m. today, October 22, 2020. So it will only be available until 7 p.m. today. And the links will be found in the comment section of both the Facebook Live and the YouTube video. And lastly, we encourage you to share this webinar to your networks with the hashtag CEAPcares, hashtags #ILoveCatholicEd. So now we shall now proceed with the webinar. So to introduce formally the series of webinars that will be coming up in this month, the current episode, and our speaker for today, I would like to introduce our Executive Director, Mr. Jose Alan Arellano.
Thank you very much, Carlo. Magandang hapon at mabuhay. Welcome to the first webinar of the fourth leg of our CEAP webinar series. Since June this year, we have been having webinars as service to help schools transition to the new normal and also as part of our development program for members. As you have seen during the CEAP Congress last month, we have not stopped rolling out programs even at the height of the lockdown. The first two webinar series were meant as a rollout of the work of the CEAP Task Force COVID-19 for Institutional Assessment and Response. The said task force worked at exploring the various ways by which our schools can adjust to the new normal through a school continuity plan. The first two legs of our webinar series dealt with various issues in school continuity planning for revisiting school fees, online enrollment, legal matters, risk assessment, and management to ensuring safety and security in schools. Leadership and governance in time of the COVID for designing instructional modules and choosing the best learning management systems for our schools. The third leg of our free webinar series featured 9 commission-based webinar offerings. We offered 4 webinars from the Christian Formation Commission, which took the place of the annual Christian Formation Conference with topics ranging from ensuring excellence in our schools, dealing with the challenge of dialogue and encounter in religious education, articulating the role of parents in Christian formation, and doing social apostolate and campus ministry in the new normal. The 3 webinars from the legal committee dealt with ensuring student discipline and safety during the distance learning process, data privacy in an online world, and corporate responsibilities of Catholic schools. And 2 webinars from the National Basic Education Commission that dealt with delivering modules given the different modalities of instruction and home-based schooling and the role of parents in its implementation. The 4th leg of webinars are topics that were called from the recommendations you gave us from the past webinars and from your evaluation of the first CEAP Congress last month. The first 2 webinars for this leg are co-sponsored by our partner in education, Inteligente Publishing Incorporated. So let us be intelligente together. The first one that we'll have today will deal with the issues of gender and cultural sensitivity and respect for intellectual property in module making. The second one, which will be held next Tuesday, October 27, will be a much requested teaching demonstration of strategies that can be employed in online learning for effective classroom management and to ensure a more active student engagement. The third webinar that will be held on November 5, meanwhile, will be on the most recent encyclical by the Pope, Fratelli Tutti, that was just released last week, and its implications on education. The last webinar for the 4th leg will be on November 10, and it will deal with ensuring the mental well-being of the school community during these uncertain times. Also, a much requested webinar based on your suggestions in the evaluation forms that you submitted. Please note that except for today's webinar, the next 3 webinars will be held from 10 a.m. to 12 noon. We also thank our ever-reliable partner who has been doing the web hosting for us since June this year, Raxo City. Maraming salamat sa inyo. Let me now introduce to you our speaker for this webinar entitled, Please Be Careful with Your Art. Observing Gender and Cultural Sensitivity and Respect for Intellectual Property in Module Making. She is our very knowledgeable and ever-reliable yet very unassuming CEAP legal counsel. Coming to us live from Ateneo de Davao University, where she serves as Assistant to the President for Research and Advocacy, let us all welcome with a virtual applause, Atty. Faye Risonar-Bello.
Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you, CEAP, the Inteligente Publishing in Raxo City, for inviting me to this webinar. I am happy to be here with you today and share some insights about the law on intellectual property, gender, and cultural sensitivity. These topics are quite relevant today, especially in the advent of distance learning, with teachers meticulously preparing modules week after week, quarter after quarter for their learners. Recently, we have seen modules getting lambasted online. Can we see the first slide in the presentation? Yes. We have seen modules getting lambasted online for being inappropriate, for having multitudes of errors, for not being age appropriate, so on and so forth. It is really unfair because these social media posts only show a glimpse of the real laborious work that teachers do when it comes to teaching modules. Just a bit of a disclaimer though, I do not claim to be an expert about these topics. Most of the materials I used here are borrowed from experts, from the works of experts in the various fields. So proper attribution to them would have to be given. But I will do my best to simplify their presentations so it would be easier for us to understand what these experts are saying. But I do hope that at the end of this lecture, you would gain insights on how to improve the quality of your modules, making them more inclusive, gender responsive, and respectful of intellectual property rights. So let's go to the first part. The first part, next slide please. The first part of this webinar will deal with intellectual property and academic work. When we talk about module making in relation to intellectual property, we would have to talk about published academic works, the law on copyright, and to what extent can we copy published works in our modules. So briefly, what is copyright? Next slide, please. I am borrowing heavily from the work of attorney Ernesto Salao's textbook, Essentials on Intellectual Property Law. Copyright is basically a legal concept. It gives the creator of an original work exclusive rights to it, meaning she or he can allow for it to be copied. The right, meaning the right to copy, kaya nga copyright. But it also gives the copyright holder the right to be credited for the work, which we call as attribution, to determine who can adapt the work to other forms, who may perform the work, benefit financially from the work, and other related rights. The key phrase here is original work. This is not to be confused with patents, which have more to do with inventions. These are the technical solutions to a problem in any field of human activity, which is new, it involves an inventive step, and is industrially applicable. So like the rush right now to get a vaccine for COVID. The vaccine is patentable because it's an invention. But we will see later on the examples of copyright. Copyright, let's go to the next slide, please. Copyright, on the other hand, is limited or confined to literary and artistic works. The textbooks that we use, the published works of our scholars in the university, they fall within this category. Copyright, however, is a statutory right, meaning statute conferred by law or given by law. It means these rights exist only because a law grants it, and the law provides for the scope and limitations of its exercise. For this, we refer to Section 172 of Republic Act 8293, which gives us the scope of what is subject to copyright. It is provided in this section that the scope of a copyright is confined to literary and artistic works, which are original intellectual creations in the literary and artistic domain, and they are protected from the moment of its creation. The list is actually exclusive, meaning if it's not found in that enumeration, it's not covered by copyright. For example, these are the things which are covered, subject of copyright. Books, insofar as they are relevant to us in the teaching sector, books, pamphlets, articles, and other writings, periodicals and newspapers, lectures, sermons, addresses, dissertations prepared for oral delivery, whether or not they have been reduced in writing or other material form, letters, dramatic compositions, choreographic works, musical compositions, works of drawing and other works of art, original ornamental designs, illustrations, maps, sketches, charts of works relative to geography, topography, architecture, or science, drawings, photographic works. So like in the materials, in the modules that you use, if you want to use a very famous photo and it's subject to copyright, the attribution has to be given to that in the module. Audiovisual works, pictorial illustrations and advertisements, computer programs, and the general phrase, which is at the bottom of the enumeration, other literary, scholarly, scientific, and artistic works. Again, these works are protected by the sole fact of their creation, irrespective of their form of expression, as well as of their content, quality, or purpose. Apart from original works, derivative works are also protected by copyright. Ano ba itong derivative works? So let's say your favorite book is Hunger Games. The film adaptation is called a derivative work of that novel. So if you can just imagine ano tong mga examples na ito in your module making, if you want to use it, derivative works are also protected by copyright. What are these derivative works? Under the law, these are the dramatizations, translations, adaptations, and other alterations of literary and artistic works, collections of literary, scholarly, or artistic works, and compilations of data and other materials which are original by reason of the selection or coordination of arrangement of their contents. So that is what is covered by copyright. If these are the matters protected by copyright, what then are unprotected subject matters, meaning those which are non-copyrightable? First, the idea, procedure, system, method or operation, concept, principle, discovery, or mere data as such, even if they are expressed, explained, illustrated, or embodied in a work. A perfect example for this would be the idea of math, the concept of math. That is not subject to copyright, but the particular expression of how you will teach math, like if you want to use the Singaporean method. The Singaporean method is subject to copyright because it's a particular creative expression. News of the day and other miscellaneous facts having the character of mere items of press information. The facts itself, which are covered by news, that's non-copyrightable. But if there is a creative expression in the way the news has been delivered, let's say it becomes more of a documentary series, it may be subject to copyright because there's already the element of the creative aspect in it. Any official text of legislative, administrative, or legal nature, as well as any official translation thereof. So those that you find in websites, the text of Republic Act 9262, for example, or even the text of this one, of the Intellectual Property Code, these are not protected by copyright. And finally, works of the government, broader than the earlier enumeration, broader than their official text that they publish, provided the creator must be an officer or employee of the government, and secondly, that the work done was part of his or her regularly prescribed duties. So for example, materials released by the DepEd relative to module making, these are not subject to copyright because it's created by an officer or an employee of the government, and it is part of their regularly prescribed duties. So it's covered, it is an unprotected, rather, subject matter. Now, to what extent can you get economic benefits from the existence of a copyright? Let's go to the next slide, please. The copyright or economic rights shall consist of the exclusive right to carry out, to authorize, or even to prevent the following acts. 1, reproducing the work or a substantial portion of the work, dramatization, translation, adaptation of the work, a first public distribution of the original and each copy of the work by sale or other forms of a transfer of ownership, the rental of the original or a copy of an audiovisual or cinematographic work, public display of the original or a copy of the work, the public performance of the work, and other communication to the public regarding the copyrightable work. So what are the rules on copyright ownership? Next slide, please. In the case of original literary or artistic works, the copyright shall belong to the author of the work. In case of works of joint authorship, we follow the rules on co-ownership unless there has been a different agreement that was stipulated by them. Now, this is relevant. The next slide. The issues on copyright ownership in the course of employment. This is a common question. Teacher A, who is employed by school B, created an instruction delivery plan, a teaching module, that was later published as a book. The question is, who owns the copyright? One, if the creation of that book is not a part of his or her regular duties, even if the employee uses the time, facilities, and materials of the employer, the copyright shall belong to the employee. But if the work is the result of the performance of his regularly assigned duties, the copyright shall belong to the employer. So we go back to that question. The preparation of that instruction delivery plan, the teaching module, who owns that copyright? If this is the distinction, it would seem that the school owns the copyright to that teaching module. But for example, if the teacher will write something about a book about teaching chronicles in the time of COVID, it has nothing to do with the regular duties of the teacher, but uses, let's say, a ream of paper ng school for printing. Subject to reimbursement of the amount of that ream, the copyright of that book belongs to the teacher. So let's proceed to the next slide. If these are the rights, what are the limitations in the exercise of such rights? The following acts, insofar as these are relevant to schools, because there are a lot of limitations, I just took some of those which are relevant to the teaching scenario. The following acts, insofar as these are relevant to schools, shall not constitute an infringement of copyright. Number one, the recitation or performance of a work once this work has been lawfully made accessible to the public. Or, let's say, the recitation or performance, rather, is done privately and free of charge, or if the recitation or performance is made strictly for a charitable or religious institution or society. Second, when you make quotations from a published work, if they are compatible with fair use and only to the extent that is justified for the purpose. Third, the inclusion of a work in a publication, if such inclusion is made by way of illustration for teaching purposes and is compatible with fair use, provided that the source and name of the author, if appearing on the work, are mentioned. Fourth, recordings made in schools, universities, or educational institutions of a work included in a broadcast for the use of such schools, provided that such recording must be deleted within a reasonable period after they were first broadcast. 5, the use of a work made by or under the direction and control of the government, by the National Library, or by educational, scientific, or professional institutions, where such use is in the public interest and again compatible with fair use. And finally, the public performance or the communication to the public of a copyrightable work in a place where no admission fee is charged regarding that public performance, and this by a club or institution for charitable or educational purposes whose aim is not for profit making. So the general idea is it has to be consistent with fair use, not for profit, and mostly for educational purposes. No? So malaki yung leeway na masabi natin na it's not an infringement of copyright. Balik-balik na sinabi yung term na fair use. So ano ba itong si fair use? Let's go to the next slide, please. What is fair use? Hindi yan glutathione, no, na magiging fair ang skin mo after using. But fair use under copyright law is a universally accepted limitation on copyright. Literally, fair use means using somebody else's work fairly. What is reasonable under the circumstances. It is a universally accepted limitation on copyright. While it is simplistically defined, how it is applied is actually fraught with so many nuances, insofar as the question would arise as to what extent is fair under the circumstances. When you look at section 185 of RA 8293, it says here the fair use of a copyrighted work for criticism, for comment, for news reporting, for teaching, including multiple copies for classroom use, scholarship, research, and similar purposes, is not an infringement of copyright. But in determining, next slide please, but in determining whether the use made of a work in any particular case is fair use, the factors to be considered shall include, number one, the purpose and character of the use, whether such use is of a commercial nature ba or for a non-profit educational purpose. Because if it is for non-profit educational purpose, it will fall under fair use. For commercial nature, hindi na yan siya lusot sa fair use. Number two, the nature of the copyrighted work. Was it copied from a non-fictional book? Let's say a documentary, or a chronicles, an autobiography. If you copy excerpts from an autobiography, the fair use concept is more relaxed, it's more nuanced, no potential issues of infringement there. But if you are copying substantially from a fictional work and claiming it as the original work, there is where you would have infringement issues. So the rules of infringement may be more relaxed if accounts are drawn from a non-fictional work as compared to a fictional one. Third, the amount and substantiality of the portion used in relation to the copyrighted work as a whole. So ito yung madugo. Gaano ba ka substantial, ang substantial para masabi natin na infringement na siya of copyright? The test here is this. It does not necessarily require that the entire copyrighted book or even a large portion of it would be copied. If so much is taken that the value of the original work is substantially diminished, then there is an infringement of copyright, and to an injurious extent, the work has been unlawfully appropriated. And number four, what is the effect of the use upon the potential market for or the value of the copyrighted work? So let's say, ang kinopya is just 10 pages from the book. But if that 10 pages is what makes the book very important, very saleable, then that will constitute still an infringement of the copyright. Next, please. What happens when there is a violation of copyright? Now, I'm just repeating. Substantial reproduction. If so much is taken that the value of the original work is substantially diminished. Kung may violation of the copyright, ano ba ang nangyayari? It is a case, again, of an infringement. It is a violation of the rights of the copyright holder when the material has been used without the owner's consent. This results not only in damage to the good name of the person who created the work, but it also results in economic damage to him or to her. Infringement has to be distinguished from the concept of plagiarism. Plagiarism is more concerned with the assertion by someone that the copied work is his or hers and it resulted in the wrongful recognition to the reputation of the plagiarizer and not the actual author. There is a joke that I think scholars are very familiar already. If you copy from one source, it's called plagiarism. But if you copy from many, many sources, it's called a research or thesis or a dissertation. Anyway, joke. In the education setting, can we photocopy or reproduce published works? For this, we refer to section 187, paragraph 1, which states, the private reproduction, so let's say photocopy, of a published work in single copy and must be made by, and if made by a natural person, meaning hindi corporation, exclusively for research and for private study shall be permitted. So allowed in that instance. But the permission shall not extend to the reproduction of the entire book or a substantial portion thereof, or of a musical work in which form by reprographic means. It will not extend to a compilation of data and other materials, and any work in cases where the reproduction would unreasonably conflict with a normal exploitation of the work or would otherwise unreasonably prejudice the legitimate interests of the author. So let's say you purchase one book about Singaporean math, reproduce it several times. May violation? Yes, may violation. But if let's say you reproduce only a portion of that book and only made by you exclusively for your research and private study, then that is allowed. Now, the next paragraph there is on whether libraries can do reprographic reproduction. Ano ba itong reprographic reproduction? Napaka-redundant ng word. Ang ibig lang sabihin yan, pwede bang i-photocopy ni library ang isang original the work? It may be allowed for as long as the same is not for profit. Second, you can only make a limited number of copies as may be necessary, and it must be for the purpose of making the published work more accessible for educational purposes, because the work, by reason of its fragile character, maybe it's a very old book or it's a very rare book, it cannot be lent to the user in its original form. So a very old transcript, no? Or a very old manuscript rather, it cannot be just lent to somebody in the library, no? For a very long period of time. Baka masisira yung condition ng manuscript na yun. So pwede siyang i-reproduce ni librarian, but only for educational purposes. 2, the works of isolated articles contained in composite works or brief portions of published works, and the reproduction is necessary to supply them when this is considered as expedient to the person requesting them for purposes of research, instead of lending the volumes or booklets which contain them. So it basically means, let's say you're supposed to study an entire collection of St. Thomas Aquinas' books. Very voluminous work. Do you need to get all the books? Or are you allowed, is the library allowed to photocopy pages of it and give to the person requesting them para hindi din masira yung entire collection of books, especially because it's a rare collection. So that may be allowed. And where the making of such copies is to preserve the original copy. So you have a very rare book, hard to find book, out of print book, the library can reproduce it for educational purposes to preserve the original copy. So yan yung question on whether libraries can photocopy published works. Next slide, please. Sinabi natin kanina that copyright is very unique because it's a statutory right. And it deals more with scholarly works. And what is unique about the copyright law is, apart from the economic rights, meron ding moral rights acquired or given to the copyright owner. And this is important because for us scholars, no, for those in the education setting, the respect and attribution given for published works is something that is very valuable. It's something that is priceless. In fact, it even weighs more heavily than the profit they would derive from their published work. So what would be the scope of the moral rights of the owner? Under Section 177 of the law, the author of a work shall have the right, number 1, to require that the authorship of the work be attributed to him, that his name be indicated in a prominent way on the copies and in connection to the public use of his work. So in the materials that you will reproduce, make sure there is proper attribution. Kung sino itong author na ito, dapat nakasaad sa footnotes, sa endnotes, or even indicated that it's copied from a copyrighted work. To make alterations, the owner of the work can make alterations to your publication or even withhold the publication if it's not something that he or she is amenable to. The owner can also object to any distortion of his work. So let's say issues regarding translation. ayaw niya yung translation ng derivative work na gagawin mo, pwedeng pigilan niya ni owner, wag mong ipatuloy kasi hindi ko gusto ang translation. Or even to prohibit the use of his name with respect to any work which is not his creation, which what they say is the right against false attribution. You make a work appear to be something that was his when in fact it was not. So these are the moral rights of the owner. What are the consequences of copyright infringement? So kung may violation, ano ba ang pwedeng mangyayari sa isang tao na nag-infringe ng copyright? 1, an injunction can be issued against him to restrain such infringement. So pigilan ang pag-publish or ang pag-disseminate ng mga books na merong infringement of copyright. Pwede kang magbayad ng danyos sa copyright owner, not just actual damages but probably even moral and exemplary damages for the sleepless nights na naranasan ni copyright owner sa infringement na ginawa mo. And in addition, criminal liabilities can also be imposed against this person who infringed the copyrighted book. For the first offense, 1 to 3 years imprisonment plus a fine of 50,000 to 150,000. For your second offense, 3 years to 6 years. And ang fine, 150,000 to 500,000. And for your third offense, 6 years to 9 years plus a fine of 500,000 to 1.5 million. Hindi pa amended yan to reflect the actual value of the fine that should be imposed, no? But anyway, it's still a big amount. So what are the takeaways? The things that you need to remember when module making relative to intellectual property rights, no? 1, copyright is confined to original creations of literary and artistic works. 2, these works are protected from the moment of its creation. 3, ideas, concepts, principles, discoveries, and the like are not subject to copyright, but the particular expressions of these ideas may be subject to copyright. Number 4, news of the day is not subject to copyright, but a creative expression of how news is delivered may be subject to copyright. Official government texts and issuances are not subject to copyright, but you do need to secure a permission to use the same as a general rule. 6, if the creation of the scholarly work is not part of an employee's regular duties, copyright belongs to him or her. But if it is part of his or her regular duties, as in that example of a teaching module, then as a general rule, it is the employer who owns the copyrighted work. 7, fair use is a limitation of copyright. But if there is a substantial reproduction of the work to the extent that the value of the original work is substantially diminished, then there is an infringement of copyright, and to an injurious extent, you have unlawful appropriation. 8, photocopying of a book may in some instances be allowed, such as if done by a natural person, single copy and only for private study, or it may be done in parts for scholarly use as requested by the scholar and done by the library in the case of voluminous works, or to preserve the integrity of an original copy. 9, the owner of a copyright also has, apart from economic rights, moral rights, the right to be properly attributed for the copyrighted work. And 10, copyright infringement is a criminal offense. Apart from imprisonment, a person can be civilly liable for damages. So ano ang moral lesson? Sa paggawa ng ating module, kailangan may proper attribution sa tao, sa source ng inyong mga materials if it is a copyrighted work. So let's reserve the questions sa ating Q&A portion. Let's go to the next part of the topic. Ang hirap nito, walang connection. Gusto ko sana i-connect si copyright pati si sex and gender, pero parang wala atang, kung may connection, tenuous at best, and I have not yet found it. So let's go to topics, discussions on sex and gender. This second part of my lecture is a quick discussion about gender sensitivity in module making. Itong gender sensitivity na ito, napakahabang topic, napakalalim ng topic. It can cover even a semester's discussion. So kung may mga na-miss out ako, paumanhin, pasensya na, but I'm trying to distill it as best as I can. And I used, for this portion, materials care of the Women of Talikala Foundation. It's an NGO that is working here, based here in Davao City, working with the abused women in Davao. May mga cases na ganun. But I'm grateful to them for these materials. I think it is very relevant that we revisit basic gender concepts. When we encounter very unfortunate posts like this one, can we go to the next slide? Which gained notoriety. Ay, hindi pa. Sorry. Hindi ko pala napasok yun. Anyway. If you can remember, in Facebook, there was a trending post about an excerpt from a module that used malicious names. No? When we encounter very unfortunate posts like that one, it would appear that the important principles on gender have not been fully internalized and implemented. It leads to the trivialization of what could readily be seen as offensive and not at all gender sensitive. And if we tolerate this, it can be construed as our consent that abuses like these are okay. So let us review. Are the concepts of sex and gender the same? Gender is very much related to sex, and many people are often confused about the distinction between sex and gender. But these two are very different concepts. Briefly, no? Next slide, please. Sex, is a biological concept. It is the physiological condition of either being male or female. It is constant across time. It is an ascribed status, constant across time, society, and culture. There are clearly identified determinants of sex, like in terms of chromosomes. Si female XY, tama ba? No, the male is XY, the female is XX. Reproductive organs and secondary sex characteristics. So biological si sex. Next slide. Gender, on the other hand, they refer to the psychological and socio-cultural characteristics attributed by a given culture to males and females. It is what makes one masculine or feminine. And this may change across time, place, and culture. So let's check if you are able to see the distinctions between gender and sex. Do you have a piece of paper and pen in hand right now? Even the MC, baka meron ka. I want you to jot down on your paper S if the sentence pertains to sex and G if it pertains to gender. Let's go to the first slide. Next slide, please. Okay na yan. Sorry. Okay. The first sentence, women have a developed uterus and can become pregnant. S or G? Tingnan natin. Can you click? It's S. Next slide. Women as mothers. Okay, hindi nasama. Okay, ito na lang. Sige. The voice pitch of a boy changes as he grows older. S or G? Click nga natin. S. Next slide. Decision-making in the community and the larger society is dominated by men because it is they who are involved in the economic activities that society values. S or G? Click nga natin. Gender, G. Next slide, please. Sex chromosomes present in the sperm determine whether the offspring are genetically male or female. S or G? Let's click. S. Next slide, please. I am a woman, and so I am not a good planner and decision maker. S or G? Let's click. G. O nga naman, ang dami dyan mga babae na magaling mag-multitask. Women give birth to babies. Men do not. S or G? Let's click. S. Next slide. Little girls are gentle, boys are tough. S or G? Let's click. G. Next slide. In ancient Egypt, men stayed at home and did weaving. Women inherited property and men did not. S or G? Let's click G. So why is the distinction relevant? Let's go to the next slide. Because gender appears to be cultivated by societal and cultural norms, the assignment of roles based on gender can potentially give rise to marginalization, subordination, discrimination, the establishment and reinforcement of stereotypes which may not even accurately reflect a male or a female's role in society. So look at these slides, for example. Next slide, please. Ano pala to? Okay. Yan. As early as birth, gender roles are assigned and assumed. Some might say this makes things simpler, having this dichotomy. Na si boy blue, si girl pink. But in other aspects, it germinates the seeds of misplaced ideas and notions. Let's take a look at this other slide. Next slide, please. Next slide. Can you click? Ay, wala pa pala. Sorry. Let's stop there. The word feminine is always associated with being submissive, gentle, emotional, talkative, or expressive. Whereas the word masculine is associated with being dominant, unemotional, aggressive, and confrontational. Is there a problem with this? When we attribute character traits or assign roles based on gender. Oftentimes, can we click na the rest of the slide? Oftentimes, it reinforces values which do not faithfully reflect a person's role in society. Like, men are not allowed to cry. Next slide. The perpetuation, so these are the gender roles attributed to males. The perception is that they are strong, they are rational, and they cannot feel. And their role as males, hard work, they're perceived as the leader or the boss. And their expectations, they do not cry. The perpetuation of this myth causes our male population not to honestly confront their feelings, to express their emotions, lest they be perceived as weak. These gender roles deny males, next slide, access to the nurturing, emotive, other-oriented world of domestic life. On the other hand, the next slide, please. Women are perceived as meek and mild. So the perception, they're weak, secondary, emotional, and they cannot think. Their roles in society, hindi pwede ang hard work, hindi considered siya na leader material, boss material, not capable of making decision making. And what are the expectations for females? Stay at home, you don't assert, you don't participate in decision making, and it is okay, very okay to cry. May assignment of gender role na yan. And because we are teaching kids in the basic education sector, I think most of the watchers, the viewers here right now are teaching in the basic ed. This slide is quite relatable. Next slide, please. Ay, wala na si ano. Yeah. Anyway, the assignment, let's click. The assignment of these gender roles to women deny her access to the public world of work, achievement, independence, and power. Next slide. Nawala yung slide ko ng Disney. Pinakita ko sana doon yung mga Disney princesses at yung mga archetypes all throughout the years. In 1951, si Snow White perceived as this and this. Very submissive, very meek and mild. And the transition to the latest Disney princesses right now that are more assertive, more women empowered. Anyway, so to reiterate, sex is a biological concept. We are born either male or female, and this cannot be changed generally. Gender, on the other hand, is socially constructed. We are not born with it, and therefore it is changeable. In the world of education, we have to be very careful in laying down certain constructs. Are we reinforcing constructs that may prove to be harmful in the long run? Are we perpetuating a culture of gender stereotyping? For example, next slide. In Araling Panlipunan, when we discuss the roles of the members of the family, do we still adhere to these notions? Ang nanay ang naglalaba, nagluluto, nag-aasikaso sa mga bata. Ang tatay naman ang nagtatrabaho o ang breadwinner para sa pamilya. By citing these in our modules, it may completely disregard the concept of shared responsibilities undertaken by family members. A mother may, in some instance, become the breadwinner, while the husband may decide to stay at home and be the caretaker of the children. Next slide. In discussing community helpers, do we still assign genders to certain professions in the pictures that we use? Can we continue clicking so we will see the professions? Yan. Sundalo. Ano ang mukha ng sundalo sa inyong teaching module? Lalaki ba? Abogado. Lalaki din ba? Doktor. Lalaki ba? Nurse. Babae ba? Guro. Babae ba? Magsasaka. Lalaki? Hairdresser or manicurista. Member of the LGBTQ community? Secretary, babae ba? When these materials are included in our modules, it only reinforces false concepts that a woman cannot pursue a particular profession because it has been stereotypically been identified as a male profession and vice versa. Materials like these marginalize rather than open up possibilities. It makes our learners think that there are limited opportunities for them based on their gender. Or in the other spectrum, because they want to defy the stereotypes, they will assume or they will aspire for what has been perceived as a male-dominated profession. So they carry multiple burdens. They want to, let's say, pursue the profession of being a lawyer, abogado. But dahil merong expectations sa society, they take on multiple burdens. They will take care of all the other domestic responsibilities on top of being a lawyer, exercising the field. So may mga ganong klaseng nuances din sa gender. Not just stereotyping, merong the taking of multiple burdens. And it's also not fair because nga meron namang concept of shared responsibilities. These misplaced notions on gender also cultivates gender bias. Gender bias refers to the tendency to favor one gender over another, such as the preference for men over women. Let's hire more men kasi hindi nagpa-file ng maternity leave. Paternity leave lang, no? So 10 days, 15 days compared to the women right now na ang maternity leave mahaba na masyado. So may ganong klaseng gender bias. For heterosexuals over someone who is a member of the LGBTQ, wag natin ikunin ito si Miss so and so na isang trans kasi kailangan pa natin gumawa ng sariling CR. These are some examples of gender biases. As early as basic education, teachers in the basic ed, we have to cultivate an environment of respect for a person regardless of one's gender. This extends to the development of learning materials that could potentially reinforce gender biases if not carefully curated. I do recognize, though, that this task is challenging, especially if one were to consider the age appropriateness of the material that will be used. And in this aspect, discernment is really important. For us in Catholic schools, medyo magaling naman tayo dito discernment, no? How will I teach this to the children in a Catholic way? And on top of that, i-layer pa natin. Catholic way in a gender-sensitive way. Meron pa isang layer mamaya, but that will be covered by the third topic, no? Let's take a look at that most talked about module coming from a Catholic school that went viral on social media. Ayan. Yan yung sinasabi ko a while ago. What was so wrong about the use of these sexually suggestive names in this module? If I can remember it correctly, ang sabi or the explanation was it's not meant for the dissemination to the children. Isa lang daw ito ang teaching module para sa teachers. So dapat internal document, hindi dapat ito lumabas. That it objectifies women, true, and yes, it is downright offensive. That's offense 1. Underlying that notion, though, is the idea that it was okay to objectify women by including it in this module. This is the trivialization of the gender bias that I was talking about a while back. And this is something we have to watch out for when we design our modules. How was this trivialization manifested? When it was rationalized as a material that was not meant for circulation to the learners, that it was meant to humor the teachers who will be reading the module. This is trivialization, or the attempt of making something important as something very small, something very trivial. Hindi lang dapat pinag-usapan. Trivialization is merely another form of subordination, which, as earlier mentioned, is a manifestation of a gender bias. I have seen another social media post, and this time it was allegedly from a DepEd module. Ito siya. For a health class, I don't know if you can still click on that link, no, that was there, the one in blue. For a health class, because it's supposed to be a health module class, the topic virginity was discussed. Okay, let's take a look at that. Is there something wrong with this? As a secular government office, I humbly believe that the DepEd is not in a position to discuss issues on morality or the double standard of morality in a health subject. If it were a Catholic school teaching religion and morality, maybe there will be allowed nuances, no, on virginity, the discussion of virginity. On another aspect, the discussions on why virginity is valued in that slide is really disturbing. It appears to reinforce stereotypes, which is another manifestation of a gender bias, that women are more valued when they are pure, they are virginal. This is one of the most dangerous stereotypes I have been privy to, because I witnessed stories and even cases where in court, a witness's testimony was not readily perceived as credible simply because she admitted that she was not a virgin. Daming mga ganong klaseng kaso sa korte, porket labeled siya as a very easy girl, madaming boyfriends, madaming ka-fling, hindi na pwedeng ma-rape. So that's a very false notion. So some takeaways on this part of my lecture. Next slide, please. Sex is a biological concept. No, it is the physiological condition of either being male or female. It is constant across time, society, and culture. Number 2, gender refers to the psychological and socio-cultural characteristics attributed by a given culture to males and females. It can change based on societal and cultural norms. 3, the assignment of roles based on gender can potentially give rise to marginalization, subordination, discrimination, the establishment and reinforcement of stereotypes, all of which are manifestations of gender bias. Number 4, as educators, we have the obligation to carefully curate our materials to ensure that we do not reinforce these manifestations of gender bias in our teachings. So that ends the discussion on sex and gender. Kung may mga tanong tayo dito sa portion na to, let's reserve it for the Q&A. Let's proceed to the last part of my talk on cultural competence. From cultural destructiveness to cultural competence. For this portion, I would like to thank the people of the Madaris Volunteer Program, the MVP, for the materials they have generously shared with me. Let me begin by quoting from their resource material. Next slide, please. Culture plays a central role in learning. Therefore, an awareness of students' cultural and ethnic backgrounds is a tool in developing a positive academic environment. Cultural competence is of increasing importance to educators, especially in the K-12 continuum. This topic is so rich that it actually merits another full-length webinar. No? But preferably not me, because I'm not really an expert of this. But I will try to distill some points that we can hopefully take away for discernment as we continue to refine our learning materials, teaching materials. It is important to situate ourselves at first. How culturally competent are we? For this, let us refer to Cross's cultural competence continuum and discuss each stage. Ang sabi niya, stage 1 is cultural destructiveness. This is characterized by attitudes, policies, and practices which are destructive to other cultures. There is a purposeful destruction and dehumanization of other cultures, as manifested perhaps by biases and prejudices, the assumption of cultural superiority, the eradication of other cultures, or the exploitation by dominant groups. So yan ang stage 1. Are you culturally destructive? Stage 2, cultural incapacity. This is characterized by the unintentional cultural destructiveness. There's a biased system with a paternal attitude towards other groups, or it could be characterized by ignorance, fear of other groups and cultures, or the existence of discriminatory practices, the lowering expectations, and devaluing of groups. That is stage 2, cultural incapacity. Stage 3 naman is cultural blindness. It is the philosophy of being unbiased, the belief that culture, class, or color makes no difference at all, and that traditionally used approaches are universally applicable. It is a well-intentioned philosophy, but it's still ethnocentric, no? Centered on your ethnocentricity. Hindi, walang consciousness of the other. Stage 4, cultural pre-competence. This is characterized by a realization of weaknesses in working with other cultures, the implementation of training, assessment of needs, and the use of diversity criteria when hired, the desire for inclusion, the commitment to civil rights, but it also includes the danger of a false sense of accomplishment and tokenism. Yung token recognition na ito siya coming from the minority group. There's really no sincere recognition or sincere competence as regards culture, the recognition of the other's culture. Stage 5 is what they call as cultural competence, characterized by an acceptance and respect for differences, the continual assessment of sensitivity to other cultures, the expansion of knowledge, and hiring a diverse and unbiased staff. Ano to eh? I think regarding establishment. Stage 6, cultural proficiency. When cultures are held in high esteem, constant development of new approaches, you seek to add to the knowledge base by the awareness and the understanding of various cultures, and advocates for cultural competency with all systems and organizations. What stage are you in? It is important to locate yourself because as an educator, in order to communicate effectively to your learners, you have to know where you are and you have to know how to go about it, how to transcend from where you are to that stage of being culturally competent at the very least. The aspiration is to be culturally proficient. Let's take a look at this excerpt from a module prepared by the DepEd. Naging viral din ito sa Facebook at natawa ako kasi namok. Initially natawa ako. But what is so about it? What is so problematic about it? There's nothing problematic about it because the medium of instruction was the mother tongue. Now, this particular photo also went viral as it pilloried the DepEd for not reviewing properly their materials. And the comments regarding this actually is the perfect opportunity to discuss cultural competence. If you are able to follow that social media post, there was an initial criticism na DepEd reviewed the material, hindi naman maganda na translation ito, mosquito, naging namok. But the comments there, parang particularly one was coming from a professor in the Visayas region. Namok is actually the appropriate term that was used because it was a module using the mother tongue as a medium of instruction. And according to them, Namok is the translation for mosquito. It might be a very old term kasi maybe ang iba ginagamit na rin nila ang term na lamok. But Namok is a perfectly acceptable translation for mosquito in Bicolano, Hiligaynon, Cebuano, and I think Waray. As to whether this in fact is true is not really the point. No? The reason why I brought this out is that it clearly depicts the stages of cultural competence. When you look at that thread, you can see the various stages from cultural competence down to stage 1, yung cultural destructiveness. There's a lack of awareness. There's a bias against one's culture that perceived as more superior over the other. Those who arrogantly think that lamok is the only translation for the word mosquito can probably be identified as belonging either in stages 1 to 4. And you can see that in their comments. While those who have entertained notions that this was a mother tongue instruction, and they use that term namok as the translation, are most likely belong to stage 5 to 6. So how do we reach cultural competence then? There are 4 steps to cultural competence, from cultural knowledge to cultural competence. First, cultural knowledge is the familiarization with selected cultural characteristics, history, values, belief systems, and behaviors of the members of another ethnic group. So yan, acquiring knowledge, nandun siya sa pinakamababang tier. The second one is cultural awareness. When you develop sensitivity and understanding of another ethnic group, this usually involves internal changes in terms of attitudes and values. And 3, cultural sensitivity. Knowing that the cultural differences as well as similarities exist without assigning values like which is better or worse, which is right or wrong to those cultural differences. So cultural awareness and cultural sensitivity belong to that tier on making meaning. And finally, cultural competency. Cultural competence emphasizes the idea of effectively operating, which includes action and structural change in different cultural contexts and altering practices to reach different cultural groups. This refers to the transfer of learning. That's the final tier. So what are the features of cultural competence? The final tier. First is when you institutionalize cultural knowledge and adapting to diversity. Culturally competent educators and the institutions they work in can take a step by institutionalizing cultural knowledge so they can adapt to diversity and better serve the diverse population. If you want to look for legal basis, you can actually find it also pursuant to our provisions in the Constitution, and even RA 10533 or the Enhanced Basic Education Act of 2013. Basic education shall be made learner-oriented and responsive to the needs, cognitive and cultural capacity, the circumstances and diversity of learners, schools, and communities. It shall recognize the purposes and aspirations of learners for their personal development and participation in national development. So yun mga merong basis in law to make our learning materials more culturally inclusive, more culturally competent. Let's say in the teaching modules in the Madaris or in the BARM, you have a lot of DepEd issuances, no? Policy guidelines on education, the standard curriculum, the integration, for example, of Islamic studies and Arabic language to the basic education curriculum in the private Madaris. No? So, may mga ganung klaseng legal basis na po na to make our learning materials more inclusive. The second feature is to value diversity. When you accept and respect differences, the different cultural backgrounds and customs, the different ways of communicating, and the different traditions and values. Feature 3 is being culturally aware. And culture meaning the sum total of an individual's experiences, knowledge, skills, beliefs, values, and interests. It shapes the educator's sense of who they are and where they fit in their family, school, community, and society. So when you situate yourself, this is your culture, but as an educator, you also have to be very conversant of your students' cultural background. So that's the fourth feature. Knowledge of the student's culture. Educators must have some base knowledge of their students' culture so that student behaviors can be understood in their proper cultural context. So important before you even design your module, or when you design and you try to adapt to it, when you try to implement your module, you have to be aware of your student's cultural profile. Ano ang religion niya, ano ang ethnicity niya, language, socio-economic status. In feature 5, the dynamics of difference when you try to anticipate what are the potential areas of conflict, knowing what can go wrong in cross-cultural communication and how to respond to these situations. Let's say you have in your student population, meron ka dyan Catholic, meron kang Protestant, meron ka dyan member of the indigenous community, meron dyan Muslim. How do you try to implement a learning module that is culturally responsive, inclusive, and not offensive to one or all of these various profiles of your students? So that's the challenge of an educator. But I think at the very least, you should have a base knowledge. And the first step to that is to really have a sense of their profile. Ano ba ito? Ano ang background niya? It helps in curating the materials better. So what are the takeaways in this particular portion of my talk? 1, culturally competent. Next slide, please. Culturally competent educators and the institutions they work in can take a step by institutionalizing cultural knowledge so they can adapt to diversity and better serve diverse populations. Number 2, we value diversity. 3, we be culturally aware. And 4, that educators must have some base knowledge of their students' culture so that student behaviors can be understood in their proper cultural context. I hope this has been a fruitful and meaningful talk. I do hope that I can get to answer your questions in the next few minutes. But if I cannot at this point in time, please do not hesitate to email us using the CEAP email address, and I will get back to you as soon as I can. Again, I cannot take credit for the material used, as these were all from the works of experts on the topics that I have discussed. So my gratitude again to our attorney Ernesto Salao and his book, to the Talikala Foundation, and to the people in the Madaris Volunteer Program for lending me their resources. I hope I was able to give justice to your materials, and I hope the participants have learned something from this webinar. This is a project of the CEAP in partnership with Raxo and the Intelligente Publishing. I hope that you are able to distill a lot of good things from this webinar. My gratitude to the people who made this webinar possible. Maraming salamat po. May special shout out din daw kay Bench Tenorio kasi nag-message siya sa akin kanina. Maraming salamat po. And I'm hoping for a very interesting Q&A in the next few minutes.
Ayan, virtual palakpak po ulit sa ating speaker, no? Grabe po, nagkukwentuhan kami sa gilid. Tapos inisip ko nga, o nga, no? Parang tatlong separate topics yung na-mention ni Attorney Faye. And of course, dumadating na yung mga questions natin. And yun, papag-usapan natin siya ngayon sa section na ito, no? But before we proceed forward again, may I just remind everyone again that you will receive the certificate of attendance only upon completion of the evaluation form, no? So, mag-a-appear po yan sa comment section, yung link to the evaluation form, and you only have until 7 p.m. today, October 22, to actually accomplish it so that you may get that, no? So other than that, continue to post your comments and questions, maybe even your reactions, no, to some of the questions that are being asked, no? But I guess the opening question that I want to give muna kay Attorney Faye, I guess we talk a lot about, especially sa latter part ng presentation, no? Pinag-usapan talaga natin yung, in a sense, ingrained beliefs, no? When it comes to culture, comes to gender, no? So I was thinking, ano yung mga barriers natin right now, no? That prevent us from actually reflecting about it and being more reflexive about it. I mean, I sometimes think about it, diba, in a sense na my internet, my social media, and so we are exposed to a more diverse community. We are more conscious that we belong to a diverse community, no, whether it be culturally or even in the gender, in the world of gender, diba? So there's a diversity there. But how come we're still parang nahihirapan tayo, di ba, mag-adjust to all of this? And kayo po, ano pa yung sa tingin nyo, bakit siya malaking barrier, no, to shift into that?
Yung sagot ko hindi legal, ha? So I think bordering on the philosophical. I think the paradox to our reality now is the more technologically advanced we are, the less we become more fragmented. And this fragmentation actually it cultivates, it breeds more attitudes na very parang deeply rooted in our prejudices. So there's no willingness to dialogue, no willingness to have an open mind to other people's points or views, and there's a rigid even a stubbornness to stick to what you know to be true, to stick to what you hold on as the for lack of a better term, as the Bible truth. No, so, and it also engenders that attitude of being very prejudicial, very discriminatory. And if this is the profile of an educator, it becomes very dangerous because it allows the educator, it becomes of the teaching, the classroom setting, becomes the environment for him or her to transmit his or her prejudices in the classroom. Very dangerous, especially kung sa basic ed na impressionable pa ang minds. When the challenge to create materials to impart learning that is more culturally diverse, more culturally responsive, more culturally sensitive, and gender sensitive, it becomes difficult kung walang willingness din on the part of the educator to be open about it. So I think that's the biggest barrier.
So it's really on the educator side. I really like yung point na nilagay niyo po doon sa dialogue. Even si Pope Francis, no, he's really inviting people into a dialogue, diba? He's always saying that our world is much more complicated. It's not simply black and white now. The diversity of cultures, we should be entering a dialogue, no? So in that sense, diba, that education should not just be a top-down process, but it should be a dialogical process even with students. What do you think of this, diba? Parang, is this something that's happening, or ano din yung difficulties when it comes to this?
Maybe when it was face-to-face, it was simpler. You can just ask them to converge in an actual town hall or an actual room and come up with probably a topic for dialogue. It becomes more challenging now because the conversations happen virtually. Classes happen virtually. But I think it's possible, no? Basta lang merong attitude of openness on the part of the educator. And ako naman, I think the biggest challenge will go talaga sa nasa basic ed. You're teaching very young, impressionable minds. You allow them, to instill in them that attitude na you have to respect another person's opinion, another person's views. It can be as simple as When somebody is talking, you do not turn on your microphone. You allow that person to talk. You listen to that person when he's talking and you refrain from saying something that will make the other person feel hurt. So, ganong klaseng mga attitudes ng ating educators ay kinakailangan ganitong panahon because these small things, while they may be considered as very small, they are the stepping stones towards being more gender sensitive, being more culturally aware, being more respectful of the other. Kung gamitin pa natin yung philosophical language, being respectful towards the other.
Yeah. Grabe, no? Parang may extra burden, no, on the educators to actually be very reflective about this, no? Because in a sense, you're perpetuating certain systems, di ba? Certain biases and all these gender roles, no?
Especially for Catholic educators. Because Catholicism is also about inclusivity.
Correct.
We go to the peripheries to include these people who are excluded. So to what extent are you going to do the extra mile para maabot mo sila?
Yeah. And I think that's also an invitation for us, no? But I think it's a reality that in a sense we're still in the progress of improving ourselves. 'Di ba? Parang hindi naman malinis yung mga Catholic schools in a sense, 'di ba? That we are also embedded in a structure na perpetuating, 'di ba? Tinutuloy din natin yung mga ganitong biases especially, no? And I guess yung nga, it's really a dialogue space that's needed. But maybe I'd like to bring this down, no, to a bit more of a concrete experience. At iniisip ko sa Ateneo de Davao, di ba? Parang how's your experience, no, in the Davao community to be interacting in a sense in a very heterogeneous community, a melting pot of many different cultures of different tribes of people in a sense, no? How is it, and what were the things that you had to do to build that culture of respect, no, in that sense?
As an institution, the Ateneo had to make some adjustments, siguro, but they have to create that space where people coming from diverse cultures, no, that when their ethnocentricity, their religion, their language, it has to be respected. So let's say it could be as simple as trying to be considerate in terms of in the imposition of the school uniform, for example. Kasi may school uniform si Ateneo. In the college level, for example, if you want to wear, if the length of the skirt is not something that is very acceptable to our to our brothers and sisters in the Muslim community, merong modification ng uniform para lang maging respectful tayo sa kanilang kultura. Merong prayer rooms na dedicated for them in the actual campuses. And in the let's say in the instruction of religion, there is also an awareness na since you don't belong to the Catholic religion, there will be a separate form of formation for you. So meron ding mga kinuhang mga instructors who will help you in that, and while the Catholic students are taking their CLE classes, meron silang separate na instruction. So these are the nuances that can take place in a Catholic school with a diverse population that have, when the student profile has a melting pot of melting pot of cultures rather.
Yeah. Maybe you can share some of the difficulties, no? Ano yung mga difficulties na pinagdaanan, and I guess parang what are still the things that need to be done to improve it, no? Parang in that sense. Yeah.
It's always a struggle kasi Catholic schools, we have certain things that we need to remember because these are the teachings of the church. At the same time, we also have to recognize na there should be an inherent respect for the other. So but it's something that is I think common among all schools, not just for the Mindanao-based schools. The very parang common na mga concerns would be issues regarding yung teenage pregnancy.
Yeah.
Yung issue na what constitutes as allowable na expression ng isang member of the LGBTQ community sa loob ng school. So meron namang there are certain practices which have been accepted and are respected, no, by the school, and may agreements then that are taking place, and it's a constant dialogue. I think that's the key phrase that is needed when you are teaching a class or even a community na melting pot nga ang cultures. There has to be space for dialogue to allow them to express their ideas, a respectful platform that recognizes the nuances, no, in how we perceive things, so that the educators can come up with a better way to teach the students. So dialogue is key, and it has to be a continuing dialogue with them.
Yeah. That's nice because you, in a sense, you highlighted a tension that we sometimes find ourselves in Catholic schools, di ba? Na parang we have certain, in a sense, di ba, doctrines or things that we follow. But in that sense, di ba, when we are forced into a space of dialogue, it also makes us confront, di ba, yung mga ganun, di ba? Ito ba yung tamang approach? Do we need to be rigid, di ba, when it comes to this? Especially when you mention nga na naging contentious nga yung mga issues na yun, di ba? About LGBT community expressing themselves, or even the issue of teenage pregnancy. How do you, di ba? How do you confront that, di ba? That's a really good point, no? Constant dialogue, no? Actually, ang ganda ng ito, may isang question dito, no, about religion, galing kay Sir Arthur Octubre. Sabi niya, this has been a point of discussion and continuous discernment on religious education area where supposedly a non-Catholic student is the best in religion award recipient. Di ba? Ang galing, di ba? However, the award was not granted to him or her because he or he is not Catholic. Di ba? How do we reconcile that? Di ba? Is that a violation of something, no, in the school, no, in your opinion?
Oh, I think that's also a bias in itself, di ba? Simply because the person is not Catholic, hindi naman kailangan, di ba? If you teach, you teach. And if ganun ang ranking ng bata, then ibigay sa kanya because deserving naman siya. And it should be even a point for reflection for the educator na parang, bakit ang mga Catholic students ko hindi sila nakapag naka-excel ng ganung klaseng level when from a very young age exposed na sila sa mundo ng Catholic life. Ito, somebody who's outside of the practices of being Catholic is able to excel. Nevertheless, parang it should not be a relevant issue kung yun ang achievement ng bata, ibigay sa kanya because deserving naman.
Diba? Nag-aral, maintindihan, di ba? Parang in that sense, no?
May double standard na doon na hindi ibigay, di ba?
Yeah, correct. No? Ito, I think this is a bit connected, no? Sa CLE subject daw, wherein Catholic teachings are being discussed, how can we reconcile culture and religious diversity in terms of module making, no? Maybe Ateneo de Davao actually will have a good experience in doing that also, di ba? And baka may concrete advice ka din sa mga
I hope nga meron tayong mga CLE teachers na kinuha as resource persons ngayon share sila kasi ako naman ang tinuturo ko law, di ba? Malayo siya. But siguro it's in the examples that we use in our teaching modules. It's fostering the attitude of inclusivity. We don't isolate somebody who is not who practices a different religion. At the same time, we respect also yung mga preferences. Kaya knowing your student's profile is very important. So it becomes a challenge for a CLE teacher in grade 1, for example, to ask a student to lead the class in prayer. Tapos ang estudyante pala na yon is not Catholic, Protestant. No, so kailangan mo pang tanungin before mag-start ng class. I think that's one concrete advice. Are you comfortable with leading the class in prayer? Because if not, then we will assign somebody else. Kasi baka merong talaga na very fundamental. Ayokong mag-sign of the cross, ayokong gamit ng the admonitions we make before we close the prayer, when we call out the saints, when we venerate or when we respect Mama Mary, baka hindi sa kanila acceptable. So on the part of the teacher, maybe a side discussion with the student is important, no?
Yeah.
So those small things, they do matter. It might seem very irrelevant, it might seem very trivial, but the extra mile, the extra effort that it takes to make it more inclusive for them is going to be very much appreciated by your learners.
Yeah. I agree, no? In a sense, di ba, young people are very much exposed to a lot of information outside, di ba? And that forms a lot about their opinions on things, no? And when I guess when questions are confronted with rigidity, di ba? Parang walang space for dialogue, di ba? Nakaka-frustrate 'yon, di ba? As a young person who's trying to find answers, no? To a lot of things, no? That's a really good point. Ito baka it might be a bit legal, no? Punta tayo konti doon. Is there issues in terms of, I guess, discrimination, no, when it comes to hiring, no, especially if, for example, the person to be hired is part of the LGBT community and it's to be hired for auxiliary services, mga administrative, etc. No, is that what are the legal ano there, no, repercussion? Pwede bang i-discriminate na bawal, mga ganun, no?
From what I know, wala pa atang national na legislation. Maybe it's still in Congress.
Yeah.
The anti-discrimination bill. But here in our city, meron na kasi kaming pinasa na anti-discrimination ordinance. So in this city, you cannot deny employment to somebody who possesses the qualifications solely on account of her gender preference, ang gender identity niya. Kung ang expression niya, I am trans, but I possess the qualifications of being teacher, bakit ako i-deny? If there is such a practice going on, it's violative of the ordinance. So it becomes an illegal act on the part of the employer. Kung solely on the basis of gender, yun ang reason kung bakit hindi siya na-employ or na-hire. It will be a different thing altogether kung, let's say, walang qualifications, hindi let passer, for example, hindi pwedeng magturo sa di ba? Kung yan ang requirement ng isang school na dapat let passer talaga. So, mga ganong klaseng if it's solely on account of. But in other areas, you'd have to check with your city kung meron ng ordinance. Kasi kung meron, then it becomes an illegal thing. If not, it's something that's not it's not desirable, because you would want to make your working environment or your place of employment more inclusive. Especially for Catholic schools, that's the best challenge that we could have, to create workplaces which are diverse in terms of culture, in terms of gender identity. We can have that profile kasi the capacity also for these educators to impart knowledge is multiplied when you have a diverse profile of educators.
Yeah, and that really influences the culture in your school, no? Parang I can just imagine a student will enter a school and they would be exposed to all of these things, no? And the difficulty is that if you do not in a sense educate them on how to confront diversity, pagkalabas naman nilang eskwelahan, the reality is that they would be confronted by this massive, di ba, amounts of diversity. And the question was, did the school, in a sense, did our educational institutions help us, no, in how to dialogue properly with people, di ba? Or did it create very strong walls, di ba? Nasabi ko, hindi, ito talaga yung tama, etc. When it comes to culture, di ba? Parang how many of us are conscious about indigenous people? Ako talaga, that's really one of the things, di ba? Na the diversity even of the indigenous people, di ba? So, ang ganda ng point na really a diverse educational community would also lead to a widening, no, of perspectives for young people, no? Sige po. May dito mga comments. Actually, very thankful talaga sila, Attorney Faye. Sabi niya, inspiring topic, no? And they're really learning a lot. And sabi nga na, seems that attorneys' advice are things we should have learned when we were young, no? So, it's also, that's good, no? In a sense, we're also reflecting upon our own biases, no? The things that are holding us. Sige, I'll just jump a bit straight into some issues on copyright and all these things, no? Ang una siguro yung questions about YouTube. What's our sense there, di ba? Parang when you download videos, you use it for class. Are there like violations being done there, no? Especially when
Usually,
you
most of the files naman uploaded sa YouTube are for fair use. And if it is a copyrighted thing, nakalagay din sa video nila yung copyright na symbol, diba yung C na may circle. So, copyrighted material. So, attribution can be given already kasi makikita mo na siya sa video. And even if it's a fair use material, meron pa rin attribution kasi alam mo naman yung source from YouTube, and then it's the creator of the video is credited or mentioned there. So merong attribution to the owner of the work. And then anyway, this is for educational purposes. It's not for profit.
Yeah.
Especially sa ating mga Catholic schools, no, sa ating member schools, these are non-stock, non-profit schools anyway. It would be a different thing probably if it is a channel which has paid subscribers. No,
Yeah.
baka may nuance dyan. Kailangan mong magbayad. But if you pay and then you use it for your class, then there's a proper attribution. Meron na ding recognition of the economic rights of the owner kasi binayaran mo din ang subscription. Nag-subscribe ka, 'di ba? Paid subscription. But those free videos that you see there, I think they fall within the concept of fair use already.
Yeah, I think yung general rule naman palagi sinasabi ng prof din namin, basta i-cite nyo na lang, i-attribute nyo na lang. That's the general rule, di ba? Parang ganun na lang. Ito po, actually, this was related to just your last comment. Ito po galing kay Sir Tagana. Sabi niya, good afternoon po. Maraming salamat po sa napaka-informative na webinar. Question. Some educators upload their video lectures via YouTube. Once the video reaches 4,000 watch hours and 1K subscribers, the video can be monetized per view. No? Who is the rightful recipient of the monetized value if 1. The video is taken inside school premises using the resources of the school, internet connection ng school, computer ng school, and 2nd, if the video is taken outside the school but the teacher uses the logo and other marks identifiable with the school. So ito yung mga professor siguro na sobrang galing nila magturo, naging popular sila, naging popular video nila. Yeah.
I think nasagot to, 'di ba, sa ating discussion on copyright, on who owns the copyright in the course of employment. Kung ang material na nagawa mo, the work that you have produced is something that is regularly done or it's reasonably to be expected in the course of your work, then as a general rule, it is the employer who owns the copyright unless in your employment contracts it states a different arrangement, let's say 50-50, or binigay talaga ng school sa iyo ang ownership of the copyright. But if it's something that's not related to your line of work, even if you use the school's resources, for example, you use the campus and then you're doing a blog on fashion or lifestyle, then copyright belongs to you. It does not belong to the school.
Ako, this is a bit more nuancing pa nga ito naman galing kay Whipple Ancheta. Sabi niya, I developed a computer program for an institution. The institution used the program for that matter. Then I became an employee of that institution. And during my employment in the institution, I made modifications to the program to address issues and requirements needed by the institution. Now, who has the copyright for the computer program? So I guess before siya pumasok sa eskwelahan, dinevelop niya, tapos naging employee siya, tapos para nagkaroon siya ng more improved.
I think they will have to check the terms of their contract kasi that's
okay.
commissioned work, di ba? Sa copyright law, ang commissioned work, parang it's the person who commissioned the work who owns the finished product, but the copyright, like the designs for it, the formulations, they might still belong to the person who designed it. Mayroon din may mga nuances din yan like yung mga discussion sa copyright law. A design or the blueprint of a certain building. Sino ang may-ari ng copyright, no? So like the finished product is a different thing altogether. But these sketches, the works done by him on paper, these are subject to copyright, but not the actual finished product. So may mga ganong klaseng nuances din tayo. Sa school, like in that example, the computer program, they would have to check the contract kung kanino binigay ang contract. Barring that, if the contract is silent, The commission work, ang end product kasi is owned by the person who commissioned the work, but the one who designed it owns the copyright.
Okay. So it really depends on the contract, no? Finally, it would really be dependent on that, no? Sige po. There are just like a few more comments na lumalabas dito. I guess there's one comment here, no? Sabi nga nila, thank you because this is a very substantial, no, and timely webinar, no. I think this webinar really came in a time when there are many questions being asked about this, especially how do you do modules, di ba? Considering the sensitivities of culture,
Dahil
gender.
trending, di ba, sa social media itong mga modules na to.
Oo, di ba? Nagte-trending talaga siya, di ba? At pinang-iinitan yung mga iba't ibang institusyon, di ba? In that sense, no? Sabi nga dito ni Miss Ben, no, sabi nga niya, timely and in a sense, no, Fratelli Tutti, yung ni-release lang ni Pope Francis, focuses on fraternity and social friendship, that we are all brothers and sisters, no? So in a sense, this encyclical is gender inclusive, no? And then there's cultural competence pa, no? So I think that's really a timely reflection, no? For everyone in the Catholic, ano. Ito din, galing in Xavier University. So galing po ito kay Peter Baltazar. Sabi niya, in Xavier University at Ateneo de Cagayan, we design our curriculum in such a way that non-Christian students, like Muslims, will also be educated in their faith by offering separate theology courses for them. Wow, di ba? So there's like Islamic theology in that sense. Later, they will join the Christian students in an interreligious dialogue course, focusing primarily on one's social responsibility. Wow, that's beautiful, di ba? Parang ang galing nun. Ako nga, minsan nalulungkot ako, di ba? Pinag-usapan natin Attorney Faye kanina na sa NCR, theoretically, very diverse ang NCR, di ba? Parang, in a sense, it's really a melting pot of different cultures. I'm sure there are indigenous peoples within the population. There are Muslim brothers and sisters in our communities as well. And yet, parang ang baba din ng sensitivities, no? Parang, di ba? Parang hindi ganun kagaling.
Homogenized na, parang ito na, this is Metro Manila mindset.
Yeah, parang gano'n, di ba?
Already of your ethnocentricity, your background, your ano pa yung mga the things that make you who you are. Wala na, baka yun ba yung sinasabi mo?
Yun nga parang weird nga, di ba? Parang it makes you reflect nga, bakit nagiging gano'n, di ba? Sayang because, di ba, there's a lot to learn also from schools who are very much in very good dialogue spaces, no, with all
I'm sure
these
there are schools in the NCR also that practice cultural diversity. I do hope, no, there are a lot. Sana naman.
Yeah, sana naman. Sige po, I guess we're generally ending, no, our webinar. Maybe there are just some last points that you want to share with everyone, no? As a lawyer, as a mother, as a teacher, ganun.
Ako ang masasabi ko lang, no, the task of creating modules, it's difficult enough. Layer that with if you are a Catholic educator, you have to somehow inject the Catholic principles in your subjects, regardless of the subject. That's also challenging. Add to that yung layer na dapat itong materials that you curate have to be gender sensitive also and culturally sensitive. It's not a simple thing to do, and I hats off to the teachers who spend I don't know how many number of hours just perfecting, trying to come up with these modules. So the least we can do, instead of posting the comments online on social media, we bring them to the attention of the person who made the module or to the school mismo, no? And come up with ways to better improve these modules. We're adjusting to the new normal. It's not something that we have done before. It's a very novel thing, and siguro we also help. Kasi when we post our comments online on social media, it's also a manifestation of a certain form of parang cultural destructiveness. Nasa stage 1 yan. You want to lambast another for the errors done. May ganong klaseng dimension din. Siguro when you do the modules, it's that you respect, you give proper recognition to the person whom you got the material from, yung source ng iyong materials. So proper attribution, be more sensitive to the examples that you use. Make sure that they're gender sensitive. So paminsan-minsan naman, i-feature nyo ang babaeng sundalo, diba? Babaeng doktor, hindi naman palaging lalaki ang doktor. Sa araling panlipunan, baka pwedeng ibang imahe, no, na pwede naman siguro na si tatay makitang naglalaba tuwing weekends. Para naman, we diversify it, we make it more realistic. Because it is what happens in real life. No? Hindi naman, the stereotypes are not exactly also faithful to what is going on. So I think that's just it. We try to be more discerning of the materials that we prepare. But my gratitude to you all for preparing this in these very challenging times indeed. And I hope that you are able to learn a lot from this discussion, given the limited amount of time and given the limited number of days that I prepared this. Sorry. Humingi ako ng pasensya, pero maraming salamat din at binigyan niyo ako ng pagkakataon na pag-usapan natin ito.
Ayan. So, virtual. Magandang maranda. Thank you, no? Thank you, Attorney Faye, for the wonderful, sabi ko na nga, no? It's like 3 webinars na sana ginawang isa, no? So, it's really a huge challenge, no? But I really, yung mga comments naman po ng mga tao, they're thankful. I think it's a timely topic. It's a wonderful conversation, no, to have. And I guess maybe just to end, no, some 3 points that I quick points, no, maybe some takeaways, no. I guess the first one is yung sensitivity, really, no, like really just being sensitive to all these things, no, culture, sa gender. Let's be conscious of what we say, what we write, because in a sense we're influencing a mind, no, we're influencing young people. So I guess that's an invitation for us to be reflective, to be reflexive actually about what we say, what we do, what we teach, no? So sensitivity. And then second, I think yung tough talk about constant dialogue, di ba? Parang it's a necessary thing to do, right? You cannot shut down questions just by being rigid, but I think really you have to dialogue so that both of you are open to learning from each other. Your opinions can change, di ba? And I think that's a genuine spirit of dialogue. And maybe the third, the eventuality is that maybe hopefully in dialogue, we lead to some form of inclusivity, no? Because our community is so diverse, how do we ensure, di ba, that we're still inclusive, that we respect each other's diversity in this kind of space, no? Tama yung sinabi mo, mahirap nga sa social media, no? Kasi parang minsan, nagsistrengthen yung mga positions natin, biases natin, opinions about each other. But yun nga, maybe in the dialogue, we'll allow ourselves also to be moved to be more inclusive, no? So yun, no? Marami din ako natutunan. Napa-reflect din ako, no? Parang ako estudyante na nakinig din sa ano, no? So again, thank you, Attorney Faye, for that amazing webinar, no? So I guess to our audience, just some gentle reminders again as we close this session. Please watch out for the next webinar of CEAP on October 27, no? So just watch out in our Facebook page and of course on our YouTube live as well. You can see it there. Again, we would like to thank Intelligente and Raxo City for their support in making this webinar happen, no? So with that, we shall end for today. Maraming salamat po sa inyong lahat.